Let's go. Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Matthew Hoh, who I'm very pleased to have here to talk about Afghanistan. And I thought rather than me read out his bio, I thought I would let Matt tell people who he used to be and who he is now, as you have quite the resume. So again, thanks for coming here, Matt. And if you could just let him know who you were and who you are today, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. I appreciate being here with you. Thanks for the invite. I'm Matt Hoh. I live in North Carolina in the U.S. I am a former Marine Corps officer. I took part in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with both the Marine Corps as a Department of Defense civilian official, and then as well as a State Department officer in Afghanistan. And in 2009, witnessing the escalation of the Afghan war by the Obama administration, I resigned in protest of that escalation. And for the last 13 years, I've been working against war and militarism. Finally got the intellectual and moral courage to do so. And so I belong to a think tank called the Center for International Policy, as well as a number of other organizations like Veterans for Peace and World Beyond War. And very happy to be here with you, Louis.
What specifically was your role in Afghanistan? As you said, you was in the State Department. So you wasn't involved at all in the military side of it as you were in Iraq, or am I incorrect on that?
No, I was. So I was a political officer with the State Department, and I was with a military team, something called a provincial reconstruction team. And at first, I was in the east of Afghanistan in Jalalabad, in Nangarhar province. And then I was later in southeastern Afghanistan in Zabul province, which is next to right east of Kandahar. And my role there was to advise both the U.S. military, but more so the Afghan government. So in my role, say in Zabul as a political officer, my job every day was to literally walk across the street from where the governor of the province was and spend my day with him. The idea was you're going to help mentor this person. You're going to, right? I mean, like the whole thing is really kind of farcical and very patronizing. And of course, all kinds of not just whispers, but clear aspects of colonialism and of course imperialism. But this idea that you had Americans and the Brits did this as well, and whoever was a part of the coalition, the Germans, the Canadians, the Swedes, etc. They all did these types of mentoring type of things again, which is very, very patronizing and really just meant to make sure that we were in control.
As in patronizing towards them, as in the Afghan.
Yeah, patronizing towards them as well as to I think everyone's intellect and everyone's moral fiber. That you put this farce on top of this war, and it makes it even more loathsome. And I think this is one of the things that contributes to the crisis of moral injury that you see among veterans and among people that take part in the wars. This idea that, you took part in this great lie, right? That this great lie, Sherrod Cooper-Coles, who was the British representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also as well as the British ambassador to Afghanistan, from around 2007 through 2011 or so, he held those roles. And he deliberately paraphrased. There's a great book about the Vietnam War by a journalist called Neil Sheehan, a bright shining lie. And that's what Cooper-Coles described the war in Afghanistan as. He gave this interview to the LA Times, and those are the words he used, was that everyone was going along with the great big lie, and we all knew it and we all did it. And the fact that you put this kind of window dressing on, that you would masquerade it as some type of noble effort, wherein we were helping these poor, uneducated, uncivilized people learn how to do democracy, among other things. And the levels of lie upon lie was just massive. And eventually that was the house of cards that was the Afghan war from 2001 on. That's you see ultimately with its collapse of that, in 2021, and now of course we have ruled by the Taliban again in Afghanistan, which is a nightmare, a different nightmare than what the Afghans were living for those years, those 20 years. And of course, a different nightmare they were living for the 20 some odd 30 years prior to that as well. So it is the shame that should accompany our discussion of this war for those of us in the West, and particularly those of us who took part in it like I did. There's no bounds to that shame.
So the things you're saying there, at the time, was you 100% aware that it was patronizing and sort of colonial, or are these reflections on the time there? Because I'm trying to think, what led to your resignation. Was you thinking this at the time, or was you sort of think maybe a bit, but it still has a use in my role?
Yeah, it percolates, right? And it's there. And so I go to Afghanistan after being in Iraq, and as also too taking part in war policy in Washington D.C. for many years. For the years that I wasn't in the Iraq War, I was back in D.C. working on war policy, whether it be at the Department of Defense or at the State Department, like in the Pentagon or at Foggy Bottom. And yeah, you saw these things and you lie to yourself. You make different justifications for your continued involvement in the war. You say things like the first time I went to Iraq, which was, I didn't get to Iraq until end of April or so of 2004. And, my thoughts are that, okay, this war's effed, this was obviously at the very best, a huge mistake. And as we're starting to see a grand lie, right? That this is just some really criminal operation going on here. But hey, I'm a junior guy. I'm 30 at that point. I was 31 years old. Hey, what do I know? But the other part of it too is, well, I can do good. I can be a moral actor in the space around me. And of course, that's complete lunacy. In the context of something like a war, particularly a war like the Iraq War. Whatever type of agency you think you have for your morality is going to be completely overwhelmed and taken by the immorality of that greater actor, the war, right? That natural force that's existing there. So, you're going to spend a year there in Iraq like I did, and you come home convinced that, we got to get out. This is really a tragedy and a mistake, and things are getting worse. And, all the work I had done there at that point, I was on a State Department team in 2004, and I was doing political work and reconstruction work. So, had millions and millions of dollars in cash to do that work, handing out anywhere from hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars every week in cash. Give people an example, the most cash I ever had on me at one time was $24 million in cash. I used to sleep with it in a safe in my bedroom, and I used to walk around with a suit on, my body armor over the suit, and a 22 caliber llama pistol in my pocket, and that kind of stuff. And and this is how you lived. And you're there under the pretexts of counterinsurgency so that you're going to do all these things, and you're going to connect the people to the government. You're going to build schools, and you fix the water treatment plants that our bombs blew up, and rebuild all those things. And what you saw though was that the absolute opposite was happening. For all the effort we put into winning hearts and minds, the insurgency just grew larger, because what we were lying to ourselves about, of course, was the nature of the occupation. You could spend your entire time going to briefing after briefing, talk to commanders, listen to the intelligence estimates, all those kinds of things, and you would never hear the words occupation. And you would see in these discussions of who is the insurgency, and the way the intelligence officers would brief it would be as if you're talking about you'd be sitting there as if you have been watching the crime show, like the way they use the organizational chart, as if it was, you're watching an episode of The Wire or Luther or something like that, right? And you're like, all we need to do is take out these two pieces and the whole thing will come down. Ignoring again and the fact that you could go and you would never hear the understanding that, well, why are these people fighting us? And it's because we're occupying them. The idea that there was some type of resistance, occupation, or nationalist sentiment that was the main foundation of the insurgency was something that you could attend to in terms of talking with American or British officers and never hear expressed, because you weren't allowed to express it. I mean, so this goes back about the lies and how those lies is circulated. And, and then again, you tell yourself personal lies. You say things like, well, I'm a junior mid-level guy. When I'm a senior guy, I won't be involved with something like this. I'll keep something like this from happening. So those are the lies you tell yourself. And so you end up going to Afghanistan like I did in '09, this time with the State Department, again, as a political officer. And the idea being that Afghanistan was a fundamentally different war than Iraq was. And, getting there in the spring of 2009 and seeing that the war was not at all any different than the war in Iraq, that they're the same war, basically, as long as it was the American empire that was running these wars, it was going to be the same thing. No matter how much you could discourse and speak about the differences in Afghan and Iraqi history, the differences in terrain and geography, the cultural differences, the differences in food, whatever you wanted to bring up, none of that mattered, because the only thing that did matter was that the American government and its partners, particularly the British, were occupying this nation. And so, those are the types of things that build up to the point you get where I was in Afghanistan in 2009, where prior to there, I was suicidal already. I was, I sustained myself with alcohol before I went, for the year or so going back before I went to Afghanistan. My whole life was centered around alcohol. It was a slow way to kill myself, but it was also the only way I could deal with myself. And so again, being morally and intellectually broken like that, and seeing the war, the escalation of it, the ridiculousness of that, knowing exactly where that would go, which is where it went to escalating the war, was an escalation of the war. And all it did was gather strength and support for the Taliban, because they could promote themselves as a nationalist liberation force. And, certainly if you refuse to negotiate and you get defeated, as we did in Afghanistan in 2011, 2012, when we are defeated, basically, and then the war just enters this prolonged, awful stalemate, that the Taliban are winning month by month. They're still winning. How do you think then you're now going to negotiate? You're going to get anything? How do you think anything's going to, as well as too, the government that you've built in Afghanistan, which is composed of warlords and drug lords, which is a predatory kleptocracy. How do you think that is going to sustain itself without your continued support of, in the American case, $300 million a day? That's what the U.S. spent on that war for 20 years, $300 million a day. You know what I mean? So all these things, add up, and you get to the point where you do say, in my case, and is that, okay, this is enough. I can't go along with this any longer, and I quit.
What was it specifically? That was actually going to be one of my questions. You touched on a lot of good stuff that I'd like to come back to there, but what was it that tipped you over the edge? Because from what I've just heard there, you was already broken before you decided to resign in 2009. So you could have easily sort of just stayed in that state. What was it that tipped you over the edge to resign? Because if I'm not wrong, you was the first member of the government to officially resign from the Afghanistan war. I saw the NBC article earlier, actually.
Yeah. Though, my friend, I don't know if you know Joe Glidden. He was a British soldier who refused to go back to Afghanistan, and they threw him in jail. Your government threw him in jail for a number of months. And I'll definitely put you in touch with Joe. He's written a number of great books. Terrific guy. You'd love to talk with him. But the Joe, I'll tip my hat to Joe all the time. I never went to prison or anything like that. Joe did, though, to avoid taking continued part in that war. So he'll always be a great hero to me. And if people aren't familiar with Joe, you can look him up. Joe Glidden, Glenton. Written a couple of books now. Just a great guy. But so the point, I don't think there was one singular thing that occurred. There was a number of things that occurred, and certainly, they kind of culminate and they compound and they build, and you end up, for me, I could point to a number of things. Certainly the violence, and witnessing the violence, and witnessing, seeing the people being killed, and the senselessness of it. And, again, particularly, you see the mothers who've lost their children. You see the children themselves, whether the kids are dead or as a couple of times, like twice within like a week or two, seeing some young boy with his guts hanging out of him. I mean, like that type of thing. Um, that all, of course, builds on you and wears on you. And if you're at a place where you have such an anger, like I did, towards my government and towards the people that were around me and towards our leadership, that I think was the reason why those things were able to really start to break open inside my head. And the continued lying about it. The aspects of, say, like the elections in 2009, the presidential elections in 2009, and how the Americans rushed about 20,000 troops over to. So when President Obama comes into office, there's about 30,000 American troops in Afghanistan, about 15,000 NATO troops, including British troops in Afghanistan, maybe more, and about equivalent number of contractors. And within less than a year and a half of him being in office, you have 100,000 American troops, 40,000 NATO troops, and 100,000 contractors. So within a year and a half, you end up having a 250,000-man army in Afghanistan. So when I talk about the escalation of the war that we're talking about a 250,000-man army. At the American funding of the war was over $100 billion a year at that point. So you can understand it's the real escalation. I mean, don't talk about it. People act as if it didn't happen, but go back 12 years ago to this point, and the war is the escalation of it is very serious. And it's something that's we act as if it never occurred. But so you're seeing these things, say the elections. The Americans, we rush over 20,000 troops or so in the late spring, early summer of 2009 to support the elections, to make sure that they're going to have free and fair elections in Afghanistan. And of course, it was corrupt like you wouldn't believe. I ended up at a polling place that day on an Afghan army base. There wasn't supposed to be any polling places on Afghan army bases. And I saw all the soldiers, a couple of soldiers, 2 or 3, just stuffing ballot boxes. And the ballot boxes were these big, like kind of plastic containers, Tupperware type looking things, And just these guys just putting one after another, signing the ballot, whatever, putting it in there, in this room. And just, when I report that back to the embassy, the instructions are clear. You don't say anything about it. I mean, so like just
Karzai, correct? This is for President.
This is for Karzai, exactly, for Karzai. And don't say anything. I mean, and in the meantime, you've got moms and wives and sons and daughters and brothers, and they're receiving the bodies of American soldiers coming home, and they're being told, your son died or your daughter died for democracy. Complete nonsense. And meanwhile, everyone who's in the Afghan government are, again, warlords and drug lords. We had this, one of the great lies about the war was that the Taliban were running the drug trade. Completely not true. And the United Nations, to its credit, last year about this time, did put out some information that basically said, no, that was never true. Not the case. They were barely involved. They actually got less money from the drugs than from anything else, which is what we knew. We knew that, could tell you from the intelligence we knew, and WikiLeaks revealed some of this, but big open secret that as the American government would say, the biggest source of revenue for the Taliban is the opium. It's the poppies. At the same time as Europe was experiencing an opium overdose epidemic, we're experiencing one here in the U.S. We had, here in North Carolina, where I live, in the state I live, we have 12 overdose deaths a day. So our opioid epidemic has gotten worse and worse every year. It was only slowed down a little bit because of COVID, and then it picked back up because of COVID as well, but like so you have it as occur in the American government saying, no, this is all got to do with the Taliban. This is why we have to fight them. They hate women. They love opium. They hate democracy. I mean, all these types of things. And, making a case for that this being some type of moral crusade, some type of noble venture, something virtuous about this war, and completely untrue. I mean, the biggest drug lords in Afghanistan was the Afghan government. The Afghan government was the one who controlled the drug trade. This is clear. For a while, the biggest drug lord, maybe not just in Afghanistan, maybe in the entire world, was President Karzai's half brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai. And none of this was secret. This was all open. And things like The Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post would publish these stories depicting all this. A guy named Akhundzada, who, I mean, had like just the New York Times correspondent, I think she was with the Times, it stumbled into like his basement where there was, opium stacked as high as the ceilings, and this is the president's best friend. He ran the drug trade in Helmand. And, I mean, a guy named Marshall Fahim, who was the defense secretary, who the United States was not allowed to talk to directly because he had been indicted by the United States for drug trafficking in the years prior to 2001. And now we're giving this guy who's the defense secretary over there, the minister of defense, we're giving him planes and helicopters and everything else. What do you think they did with that? I mean, like, so this great lie about the drugs, just one thing on top of the other, I mean, and again, the funding, just to let people know, maybe people are clear on that. Like, we knew the funding for the Taliban came from the Pakistanis. It came from them siphoning off of American and Western contracts, where, you'd have, I had it in my case where the province I was in, the guy who was in charge of the schools in the province, 2 provinces over in Wardak province, his brother was a well-known Taliban commander. So when the teachers didn't get paid, where do you think that money went to? And we were the ones who were paying for all that, what I mean? So like that type of stuff. But like, we also knew that the Taliban taxed anything they could, just like anyone else would. But the biggest source of income for the Taliban was from the Gulf states, was from the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris. That was the biggest source of income by far for the Taliban, our friends in the Gulf. And that was just another lie. That was just one more thing you put on top of that, right? Like, and everyone knows this, or if they don't know, it's just because they're willfully ignorant. They choose not to look at this. I mean? So, and then so it all builds up. It all builds up. And at the same time, as I said, the violence is occurring all around you, and you've got American and British. Now, I was down south, so I worked a lot with the Brits and with the Canadians and the Dutch. And they're as bad as the Americans were. Just the willingness to lie to themselves, the willingness to ignore the reality of the war. And most of these men and some women were in positions where they were going to have to be unlucky to get killed because they were in command slots. So they were, eating in nice chow halls on Kandahar Air Base in air-conditioned offices, watching movies every night, that type of thing. They weren't out with the grunts, with the infantry, whether they be American or Canadian or Dutch or British or whoever, out there killing and being killed. And just the kind of just that acceptance of not accepting reality. I think that was, for me, the anger that allowed me to resign, to say, I'm not going to go along with this. You all know it's wrong. All know it's not going to work. We all know what's going to happen here. You're adding proverbial fuel to the fire here. Our intelligence estimates say that 90% of the Taliban are not fighting because of some type of religious reason or some type of ideology. They are fighting because of occupation and because of this continuance of a civil war that's been going on since the 70s. That's a living legacy of the Cold War that we, along with the Soviets, created and we fostered and we sustained. I mean? So all those things build up. I know it's very long-winded, but it's complicated how you get to a point like that where you betray yourself, you betray who you are, you're afraid to do the right thing, you keep making excuses, you keep lying to yourself, and then finally you break down. And by breaking down, I think you are then able to say, F it, I'm just gonna I'm quitting, I'm not taking part. And a lot of it, again, comes back to my anger and outright hatred for a lot of the people I worked with, whether they be Americans, Brits, Canadians, Dutch, whoever.
Yeah, you you said a lot of good stuff there, and I have a lot of questions of that. One I have to go back to. So you talk about the opium side of it, and I'm sure you're familiar with, but I'll get this up on the screen after the UN chart of the opium growth.
Yeah.
So in the early 2001, the opium levels are completely down. The Taliban managed to squash it.
Right.
The invasion happens and it goes right up, and obviously it correlates with the opioid crisis in Europe and the US, where pretty much most of the heroin that came from the opium came from Afghanistan. And you mentioned Harman Kaiser's half brother, and there was that New York Times article saying that he was on the payroll of the CIA.
Right.
What do you make of that? I'm not saying the CIA was directing it, but obviously we was turning a blind eye at the least. What is your view on it? Was there people involved, or was they just, we need these
Oh,
warlords, let's
the,
just turn a blind eye?
the relationship between our governments and then our intelligence agencies, and we get this from you guys. Americans get this from the Brits. We learned a heck of a lot in your opium wars.
Every
We
time.
did, and there was an American presence there, and a lot of Americans. Uh, 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 a lot of Americans made a ton of money off of those wars in the
The
1840s.
Russell family, and I think Forbes as well, because the Russell
Yeah.
family obviously was involved in setting up Skull and Bones at Yale, which
Yep.
George Bush was a member of.
Right. Right. And certainly, one of our most celebrated presidents, John F. Kennedy, there's the Fitzgeralds. There, a lot of their money comes from that, and then that particularly picks up the opium and everything else, as well as parts of John Kerry's family, our current climate czar, our former Secretary of State, longtime Senator of the United States, presidential candidate. His money comes from a lot of that, right? So, but this, particularly in the modern era, the complicity between Western governments and the drug trade is there. It's not as sensational as you've got American CIA officers loading up drugs into a plane in Afghanistan. It doesn't work that way, but it's the complicity. It's the, but it's more than that though, because, if you go, and this is true for whether it's at the end of the Second World War, the way the Americans and the British and the French work in the Mediterranean with the drug trade in the Mediterranean to help defeat the communists. I mean, that's a whole thing. If people go and look at the French efforts to recolonize, to keep Indochina, to keep Vietnam, and right, you go and you look and what was the major battle there? Dien Bien Phu. What was the big deal about Dien Bien Phu? Dien Bien Phu was a huge cross trade, a huge cross trading spot for the drug market there. And the amount of money the French government was bringing in because of that was massive. So, I mean, like there's like all these things, but then of course the American government, our involvement in Central America in the 1980s, the CIA was involved exactly in Nicaragua with the Contras trafficking. That coincides with the crack epidemic here in the United States that ruined millions and millions of Americans and their families, devastated thousands of American cities and towns. I mean, just laid waste throughout the 80s, in a way that the opioid epidemic is doing now. Of course, the big difference is that, back in the 80s, crack was really devastating Black communities, and now the opioid epidemic is devastating everyone. So now, of course, it's kind of an issue for the American government. Not really, but kind of, right? I mean, but you have all this continuance. And the idea of well, how does Afghanistan even get into the heroin trade? How does it even how is this even a thing for Afghanistan? It wasn't. It comes from the Brits bringing it to India, Pakistan, to grow, to sell to China, right? And some point in the early 80s, because Afghanistan does have some of its own production, but it's very limited. And if you look at the reporting from the 1970s on heroin production and opium production, poppy production in Afghanistan, it's really they're not exporting any. It's a market. It's all internal consumption basically. But what you have happened then is the Pakistani ISI, their intelligence agencies, and the American CIA, and I probably imagine the MI6 was involved too. That they are bringing the crop into Afghanistan in order to help fund the war effort. So that's where you start.
Afghan-Soviet invasion during the 80s.
Yes, exactly. So what you have is you have the Pakistanis and the Americans, and again, probably the Brits, bringing in the crop into Afghanistan in order for a source of revenue for the Mujahideen, for the Afghanistan resistance against the Soviets. Those who win that war, if you can call it a win, but the warlords that come out of that, they're also the drug lords. And who are the people that we put back into power in 2001 when we take the Taliban out of power? The warlords. And so your point about you can see poppy cultivation in Afghanistan and how it does. The Taliban basically stop it. And then when they're thrown out of power, it just, yeah, exactly. It's like people not familiar. You say you're going to put the chart up. Yeah, I mean, it is you clearly see it's quite, it's almost it's comical in a lot of ways, you know, if it wasn't so tragic, you know. But exactly that you have, you know, we put back in charge the drug lords, the guys who owned. And it's even crazier than that, because I could tell you stories about how the programs work there. But, you know, I mean, I'll give you one just to make sure people understand what we're talking about, how insane this all was, how criminal this all was. And again, how deceptive the malfeasance involved in all this. There's a guy named Gul Sherzai, very popular among the American intelligence community. He was actually hated among the Afghan people. If people are familiar with the Afghan Taliban's origin story, it's that in the early mid 90s, they are a popular movement that rises up to overthrow the warlords because the warlords are so terrible. And there's a lot of truth to that story. The warlord who's in charge of Kandahar province, the biggest province, basically the second biggest city in Afghanistan after Kabul, a guy named Gul Sherzai, he's the guy the Taliban overthrow. Darling of the American intelligence community. So when the U.S. Comes into Afghanistan in 2001, who do the Americans put back in charge of Kandahar? Gul Sherzai. At some point, he gets moved up to be the governor of Nangarhar province, which is probably one, if not the most important province economically for Afghanistan because of its because it borders Pakistan and because of its port of entry there. So, right. and you know, so Sherzai is now in charge, the governor of Afghanistan. He's also a drug lord. And what happens is you have this governor's eradication program or something like that it was called, where the American government, if the governors of Afghanistan, the provinces, could show that they were eradicating poppy crops, they would get $10 million in cash.
The
so
farm.
What does Sherzai do? Sherzai takes the Afghan military, the Afghan police, all the support from the Americans as well, and he goes to all his competition and says, hi, you either you know, fall underneath me now and kick it back up to me, or I'm going to have you eradicated. And the ones that they eradicate, because they won't kick back or fall underneath Sherzai's thing, are the ones that Sherzai then turns around to the Americans and say, hey, look, these are all the poppy fields I've eradicated, right? And we give him $10 million in cash. Yeah. So we gave the guy $10 million in cash as a benefit or a bonus or a reward for rubbing out his competition. So what you see not only is the resumption of the Afghan heroin trade because we put the drug lords back in power, but their consolidation of that, right? Where they now really have clear monopolies throughout their regional control of these drug lords who are also the warlords, say like Adam Muhammad Noor in the north or something like that, right? Very clear. And this is the power structure of Afghanistan. And this is when you call this Afghanistan's government over 20 years a predatory kleptocracy. There's no hyperbole with that. That's not an exaggeration. It's exactly what it was. And what you see that's interesting about the Afghan Taliban and their takeover of power in 2021 is that, you know, for their entire existence, I don't think anyone would discount the notion that the Taliban were a Pashtun organization, that 96% of its support, certainly almost entirety of its membership in many ways, was Pashtun, not Tajik.
Can you just explain the different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, just for
right? And there are, I forget how many there are, but there's a number of ethnic groups in Afghanistan, and there's about 5 or so primary ethnic groups in Afghanistan, the Pashtuns being the plurality. And of course, the Pashtuns are kind of split between East and Southern Afghanistan, and of course, Western Pakistan, right? And this gets in the whole Durand line, gets back to the Brits and their colonization, right? I mean, it's that a lot of history to all this. And of course, that history, what does that history do? That history is what provides the narrative for a lot of the motifs, the myths, the origin stories, the purposes, the realizations of these militant movements like the Taliban. So when the Taliban talk about being a national liberation force, they point back to the Soviets. They point back to the British, right? I mean, it gives them a history. So much of what they do is validated by their own history, even if it is a bit of myth making. But so the Pashtuns and the plurality, again, the Taliban are a Pashtun organization. I mean, you can point to ones and twos where they're not, but you're being quite silly if you say they're anything other than that, I think. But what you see happen is because, again, the Afghan government is so terrible, so predatory, so criminal, so corrupt, that the first provinces the Taliban take in 2021 are not Pashtun provinces. They're non-Pashtun provinces. They're Tajik provinces. They're Uzbek provinces. The Hazaras, of course, didn't fall over to the Taliban quickly because there's a relationship involving genocide there where the Taliban in the late 90s tried to exterminate, in many ways, the Hazara, who are a Shia population, minority population. But you see where like these provinces that are not Pashtun are the ones that go first to the Taliban. And so you got to take a step back and say, how the heck did that happen? Right? These should have been the last. And we realize is that, well, it's because the people who've been running those provinces, the drug lords, the warlords, the Afghan government, they're so terrible. They're so brutal that the people said, you know what? Maybe they weren't fully supporting the Taliban, but they weren't going to stand in their way because these guys can't be as bad as what we have now. Now, of course, what people are experiencing in Afghanistan now in the Taliban is, as I said earlier, a different form of nightmare. The Taliban just the other day had their first public execution, so they're going back into that. And what we've seen them doing with women and girls, of course, is heartbreaking. But at this point, 16 months ago, 17 months ago, the people in the non-Pashtun provinces were saying, you know what, I'd rather see what happens with the Taliban in power than continue underneath, these criminals.
I recently read this book. It's the Afghan Papers book by Craig Whitlock. And I actually listened to pretty much all of your interviews with Scott Horton. And basically, when the Afghan Papers came out, you were basically saying it was what we was discussing this whole time. But privately, many officials did say how the people hated the government so much that was put in power, obviously, by the US, and that they were so corrupt that they was just playing the waiting game. They're like, well, we don't really like the Taliban because they're brutal, but at least, they brought more order and got rid of the warlords. And then the government were just like, well, one, they're not even, at least the Taliban is a local, ethnic group, but obviously the government's actually put in by the West, financed by the West, trained. So they're just basically waiting for them both just to say, well, we're not really going to get involved, and we're just going to see which one it ends up being because they both suck.
That's right. And so like I have this image more of I think a lot of people were expecting this resistance to the Taliban, particularly say in the north of the country where so what happens with Afghanistan is where you do have a mixed country for many years, and people will say these terrible things about Afghanistan about how they've been fighting for thousands of years, all this non-historical, completely untrue things. You have this period from the late 1920s up until the early 70s where there's peace in Afghanistan. Yeah, there's some issues, and the king has to send out his little army to put down a tribal uprising here or there, but nothing like has occurred in the last 40 years, and certainly not the genocidal type of civil war that we have seen there. And so in the late 90s, the Taliban were trying to take the entire country. The fighting against what was called the Northern Alliance, which was non-Pashtun, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazara, others, was really brutal and genocidal. I think that's a non-exaggerative term to use. I think it was genocidal in the sense that they were trying to exterminate each other. And that comes on, that's the result of, a couple decades of this war in Afghanistan. That is a result of the Cold War, the machinations of Washington and Moscow that saw divide and conquer strategies, pit one against the other. That's the American way of war, again, which we got from the Brits. We learned it from you all. In terms of divide and conquer, that's how you colonize. And so certainly you saw that in Afghanistan, you saw it in Iraq, you saw it in Syria, all kinds of places. But this point about what occurs then, what most people I think expected to happen, was that there would be tremendous resistance against the Taliban, particularly in the north of Afghanistan. And what you saw, kind of like as we both said, was the people taking a step back and saying, yeah, I'm not going to fight you. I mean, you can't be any worse than what we have now. Let's see what happens. And everyone is so tired. They've all been so victimized and brutalized. I mean, this is generations of families that have just been devastated by war. It is the I don't know if it's the poorest country in the world, but it certainly is among
Yemen,
there. Yeah.
Yemen would be
Yeah,
maybe.
Yemen, exactly. Yemen. I mean, the same thing too. I mean, how could it be anything other than the poorest country in the
Yeah,
world when everything has been destroyed? And that's what you see in Afghanistan is everything has been destroyed. There is nothing there. The only for a young man, the only job opportunities are to join the Taliban, join the army or the police, or go to Iran, go to Pakistan.
grow
You
grow
know, what's that?
grow opium.
Grow opium, but that's all controlled. That's labor. That is seasonal and it's not a job. And I mean, like it's it's not what I think. And you talk about economic opportunities, possibilities for people. It's not there. It hasn't been there for decades. And you see that where you have these issues with human capital, as it's called, because everyone who can get out has gotten out. And the problem being, of course, is that many of those who went back to Afghanistan when the West went in were opportunists.
Yeah,
And they're the ones who took advantage of it. And so any of the economic growth, which all came from foreign assistance, or almost all came from foreign assistance, was, being co-opted by these opportunists, these carpetbaggers, if you will, people like Ahmed Wali Karzai, right,
yeah.
who becomes the governor of Kandahar, and the largest drug dealer in Afghanistan, if not the world. And what was he doing before that? He was running a restaurant in Baltimore.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, now this stuff is remarkable. If you were to write a novel, Louis, right, or a screenplay, and submit it, and they get out of here. This is too far fetched. No one's going to sit through this or believe this, and that's why old adage, right? Truth is stranger than fiction, and you have this where it's just so obscene, the obscenity of it all. I mean, it's not. It gets back to all the lying about it, right, and the corruption that went into it, and just I think that book that you described, Whitlock's book, The Afghan Papers, which I certainly recommend to people. That's what it shows. Everyone was lying about it, and they all knew, and they all went along with it. And so the shame of this war and what's occurring to the Afghan people, the war hasn't ended. The war is just in a different phase. Now they're living under brutal Taliban governorship, and they're starving, they're freezing. We don't hear about this year like we heard about it last year because of the Ukraine war.
Yeah,
Just as like we never hear about Yemen, you never hear about what's happening in Libya, you never hear about what's happening
yeah.
sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, 80 people get killed in Nigeria, in the fighting there in a single day. Nothing gets heard about it here in the U.S. You've got to be attending like the websites that I go to or watching Al Jazeera or something like that to know about it, right? I mean, so it is. It's really the continuation of these wars is really quite sickening.
So I want to circle it back to something you said a while ago, and you specifically. Do you remember in 2010, 2011, a report by Congress came out called Warlord Inc. And it was all about,
Yes.
sort of, you said earlier, with basically America privatized all their supply routes to get,
Yep.
ammo, fuel, food, basically everything, because they didn't want to do what the Soviets did, where they used their army, and it turns out into war zones because there's these warlords that control different highways. And it's basically saying everyone was getting paid off along the way. So
Right.
the governor of the province, the region, police, army would set up checkpoints. Everyone basically, it was racketeering, and he compared it. He said Tony Soprano would have been proud. And I actually watched one of the hearings. It was really interesting to listen to. I actually did a couple videos on it myself when I first made the channel. Weren't the best videos, but I would recommend reading the report. Could you touch on what you saw there? Because there was direct allegations the money was going to the Taliban, and anytime there was a big aid project going on, there's millions and billions going to these projects, they would siphon off the money. Could you talk about your personal experience with that, please?
Sure, yeah, and yeah, I would encourage people too to go back and read what the reporting done by Azmat Khan, Anand Gopal, and Matt Akins over the last year or so,
Mm.
and particularly people like Azmat and Anand, who spent a lot of time in southern Afghanistan as the Taliban were winning in those final months there and taking the provinces. And what they saw, and you have this, and you start seeing it pop up in the months in October of last year or so, when they're still talking about the Afghan war in the New York Times and the Post, this acknowledgement of the outright banditry
Yeah.
that everyone had to experience, the checkpoints where you had to go through police checkpoint after police checkpoint, where you're going to be shaken down, where you got to give them money. And this happened all throughout. This is what we talk about, the predatory kleptocracy that people were living under. That was the American and British and German and NATO project in Afghanistan. That's just what it was, and so but no, this one, I want to just touch on the privatization of the war and what it allows for the American government to do and for the British government and others to do. Most people don't realize this, but more contractors were killed in the war than uniformed military members. So for the Americans, and you can't really pull up the total number killed in both Iraq and Afghanistan was over 7,000, but there were more than 8,000 contractors killed, right? So and those were all.
Sorry, what companies were these? So the only. I'm only familiar with a few private contractors. So the big one is Blackwater, obviously DynCorp, but from there, I don't know too many more personally.
Oh my God, there's so many. Tetra Tech, Halliburton, of course, is a big name. But DynCorp, Fluor, the RTI, the number. We could be here through tomorrow reading off the list of companies that profited from these wars. Anyone and anyone could be involved. And one, it was just, again, part of the neoliberal project, but both our countries have been experiencing for the last 50 years, right? The outsourcing of our government, the profit taking wherever profits can be made. And certainly that was seen with the American military. Was why should we have soldiers driving these trucks? Why should we have soldiers running generators? Why should we have soldiers, manning the chow halls? We can have private contractors do that. And, they make up the story about how it's going to save money. And of course it doesn't. It costs twice as much or more, but what you have, though, the benefit, though, is that it hides a lot of things. So those 8,000 people that were killed, many of them were non-Americans. Many of them were what we call TCNs, third country nationals. So people from Pakistan, people from India, people from Bangladesh, people from the Philippines. Those tended to be the countries that had a lot of populations among the contractors. And, but they were all doing jobs that in Vietnam, say, would have been done by a service member, by someone in uniform. They would have been driving the truck, a soldier, would have been driving a truck, not a contractor. So, really hid the cost of the wars quite dramatically. But, this one of the things that's peculiar about Afghanistan, I think people have to remember it's landlocked.
Yeah.
And how do you get in then? Well, where are the ports? Well, the only ports really two places, Iran and Pakistan. And Iran's not going to work, of course, right? For a lot of, we do a whole other show on that, right? We do a whole other show on Iran.
Yeah.
But then, you can fly things in, but you can only fly so much in. You can fly a lot more into, but so you got to bring it in by ship to Pakistan, and you got to truck it up and over the mountains and everything. So you're just looking at this, again, $300 million a day. 250,000 man army in Afghanistan you got to support by trucking it in. And of course, they're going to have all these opportunities to shake you down. But then, too, the other aspects of it where the profit taking, who do we put into power? We put into power warlords and drug lords. Of course, they were going to take their cuts. Of course they were. Why would we think otherwise? And so, again, one successive deployment, one successive group of American generals and colonels and British generals and colonels and Dutch generals and colonels after another just looked the other way. 20 some odd iterations of that where they knew this was going on. They just looked the other way. And, you would look at it. So when I was there, you would go out and you be among, go out to these little bases that we'd have out in the districts, and there might be there'd be American platoon there. And that lieutenant would have 25 soldiers or so. And then there'd be like kind of a Afghan platoon there as well. So maybe an equivalent amount of Afghan soldiers. And you'd talk to that lieutenant about the situation, and you knew what was going on in that district. And you'd say, what do you control? And he would say, quite honestly, he'd say, the only thing I can control are what my machine guns hit. So basically anything I have line of sight of their little base was controlled by the insurgency. You can't even rightly call it the Taliban, because that's a misnomer for how the insurgency actually worked. In terms of like the Quetta Shura Taliban being in Pakistan, being like the National Liberation Movement, that's not really who these insurgent groups were on the local level. But, so you'd look at this and you'd say, okay, well, how come you don't get overrun? It'd be very easy for them to mass and overrun you. We would never be able to get reinforcements to you in time. Never. Why doesn't it happen? So what you come to is a realization, two things. One, our air power. They don't want to mass because then they become vulnerable to our attack aircraft and our helicopters. But the other thing, too, is that the more important thing, I believe, is these things were a fountain of money. That lieutenant, besides having his 25 soldiers and 25 Afghan soldiers or whatever, he got about $1 million a year to spend in that district. Now, that district in Afghanistan is among one of the most poorest places in the world. Probably in the last 200, 300 years, if you were to aggregate all the wealth in that district, it wouldn't add up to $1 million. And now you've got a 24-year-old American lieutenant who has this money to go and spend to build schools, dig wells, do whatever. Well, who do you think, this is where you get to the point about who is benefiting from all this? Insurgency knew this. Why are you going to overrun and one risk that now the Americans are really going to come in fourth, and you got to deal with that? All you got to deal with is this 24-year-old and his 50 men. You can handle that, and you don't have to worry about the air power coming in, you guys getting bombed, everything. But also, too, if you were to do that, it's a chance you're going to lose that $1 million a year or $2 million a year or $3 million a year, whatever we were spending in those districts. And so you look at that, you just say, my God, we were just basically providing cash to the insurgency over and over again. And certainly everyone was related, everyone was connected. As I said earlier, example I use is the school person who was in charge of the schools, but there are many examples I could use to describe that, and that was, everyone was getting their cut. The Afghans would say things to you like, we call this the golden age because now's the time to get the gold. And the whole thing was a wash, and everyone was making out. Everyone was earning money. As I said before, one of the 3 or 4 biggest sources of income for the Taliban was not the drug trade, but the contracts that the West, that NATO was spending over there. And so I think all those aspects of it made it just an absolute, this was an orgy for thieves, if you will. Where people got absolutely, and the Afghan government, of course, whatever the Taliban got was minimal compared to what the Afghan government took. And the billions of dollars that were leaving Afghanistan every year in cash, the billions of dollars that were leaving in cash, again, well known. Front page stories in the Washington Post about how they're trying to, the U.S. Treasury Department's installing money detectors at the Kabul airport to try and track the amount of money leaving the country, because it's mounting into billions.
It was going to the UAE, so I remember seeing articles in, I think it was the Washington Post, like suitcases of cash going to Dubai and the UAE. And wasn't there a whole scandal with the Kabul bank in 2011?
Yep.
Could you?
Yeah, the money just kind of vanished. Yeah. And so one of my favorite stories is, and this is, we know this thanks to WikiLeaks. What's his first name? But Massoud, Vice President Massoud. So the Vice President of Afghanistan showed up in Dubai with $50 million in his suitcases. Just traveled there like that. With $50 million. So the amount of money, and it all went offshore. And so where did these people go? And the stories about Ashraf Ghani fleeing in August of 2021, how he had however much. And I know they've done some work. The Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction on the American side has looked into it. Yeah, and it doesn't seem likely that he took as much money as people were saying he did. Though I'm pretty sure he took some, So, but like, yeah. So, where did it all go? And it went, as you said, to to the Gulf, to Afghan government officials and generals were buying apartment buildings, not apartments, apartment buildings in Dubai. Right. I mean, so like, yeah, I mean, a lot of people got rich, a lot of people got wealthy, but the American aspect of this, I'm not too sure about how it worked with like your DFID and everything in Britain, but certainly the corruption on the American side. So it was immense. I mean, like the number of people who in the United States now own second homes and drive BMW M3s or M5s now because of this war, is legion. And you had the aspects of like when the American government would when the American Congress would appropriate billions of dollars for Iraqi reconstruction or Afghan reconstruction, the estimate is about 40% of that never leaves the United States. Never. I mean, like that's the overhead cost that goes right to the American contractors right away. 40%. Yeah, and then it starts to get, then you got to pay for security, and then you got subcontractors, and that's why the estimate was that on the ground there, only about 10% of every dollar the American Congress appropriated actually made it to building a school or what have you. And then, as we know, because again, reporting by things by a Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, but also journalists like Azmat Khan, we know that 80 to 90% of the things that the American government, that its counterpart, the DFIG counterpart, USAID, that it claims it built, can't be found. So journalists or American inspectors have gone out looking for these schools or these healthcare centers that were supposedly built. They don't exist. They can't be found.
Yeah, there was loads of that in the Afghan papers when they was talking about all these projects, and they're trying to give like electricity to these rural tribal towns that've never had it, so they don't join the Taliban and we can win their hearts and minds. And there was all these projects. I think there's one with a dam, and then it just doesn't exist. The money just went away, and basically they were saying Congress was just give us this money, and no DOD official is going to say, well, we don't need that much. Right. It's back. They're just going to spend it. And it basically inspired no one really trying to come up with real ideas. It was just like ideas that just, here's some money for that. Here's some money. Because no one really has to think about it, because you're not like, the budget's a bit low, so we need to be careful. They're just like bags of money just going around everywhere.
Well, and the money you spent was a metric in and of itself. So if you spent more than the previous guy, you were doing better. Right. I mean, that was the metric, and the American military had came up with this idea of a doctrine, basically money as a weapon system. Right. Yeah. It was non-kinetic, as they called it. Kinetic, you shoot somebody, you give them money. It's non-kinetic, I guess, but the idea that you're going to, and I did this is what I was doing in Iraq, trying to use all that money I had to try and buy loyalty, to try and buy allegiance. And, it just doesn't work. That's against human nature. It's against who we are. It's against all our, particularly say like our origin stories here in the U.S. about, about our revolution and everything else. Like why, why would you think it would work? And we did, and it didn't work. And in many ways it aggravated the war and escalated the wars. But the, you had things where, like I say, a city I was in Zabul, Kalat, they built a diesel electrical generation facility without any thought to, one, how they'd ever get the diesel to the facility or how the diesel would ever be paid for. So they built this diesel generation electrification plant, and it barely runs. It runs for a few hours a day, but then that gets trumpeted as a triumph. The same thing too. We had this project where they went around, they put these radio antennas all throughout the country. And I remember writing up about this because it was established in our province. But the problem was there was no fuel to run the generator to power the antenna. There was no material to put on the antenna, right? So what are you going to broadcast, right? There was no way to record material to broadcast. This is 2009, so things, now be easy to do, right? But we didn't have that then. And then, more importantly, I think the Afghan population didn't have radios. I mean, but what gets reported back to so I send this up and say, hey, okay, the antennas got put up, but again, no fuel to run them, no material to put them on, no ability to record material, and the Afghans don't have radios. And what gets sent back to Washington, D.C., smashing success. The antennas are up. We're going to win this like a lot. Here comes Hearts and Minds just going to be streaming to us now because we're going to talk to them by radio. Because what at least the acknowledgement was is that we are losing the information war here. We are getting crushed on the information side of this because but how do the Taliban do it? They put two dudes on a motorcycle and they drive from village to village, and that's how they communicate to people. And I mean, but the amount of money that probably went into that, and in a way it was then characterized as a success when it was nothing more than just a hulk of metal sitting on the top of a hill someplace now. That's all you did. So you built this monument to waste and corruption and ineffectiveness. And so over and over again, those stories occurred, but people made a ton of money. So, I think those people, they're careerists, they're opportunists who rather yes men, yes women, or they saw like, the go along to get along type of thing. Or for those in the U.S. military and the U.S. government, the CIA, the State Department, what have you, you're going to spend, 6 months or a year working on this war, and then you can forget about it. If you're in the CIA, you can go back to focusing on China or whatever. You're in the State Department, you can go back to, you go back to your assignment in Brazil. You're only temporarily in Afghanistan, and if you're in the military, what you do is you say, well, I'm not a policy person. I execute policy. I don't make policy. This is above my pay grade. I'm just concerned about getting my soldiers home alive. All those excuses, again, all those lies, those justifications, those rationalizations that, taken en masse, allow these wars to be sustained and propelled. And, exactly. And the result then is, of course, is 40 some odd years of war for Afghanistan, and the Taliban are in charge.
It is approaching an hour, so I don't want to take up too much, but just for a few more questions, you kind of nailed it there, but what do you think the reason was for the war going on so long? So you just said that, what was there, arms corporations? Is it the army wanting more bases, regional influence, or is it just, as you said, they're gone in 6 months, they're gone in a year, or no one in the military wants to speak out because they're careerists and they want to become a general, and as you said, they're not policymakers? Do you think it's more just, it's not my problem, I'm going to do my bit, leave, rather than the more nefarious, it's Lockheed Martin and Raytheon lobbying? They might be part of that, but the main cause, do you think it is just people not wanting to be the one, like you did, being the whistleblower, and obviously that ruins any chance of you, being in a think tank or a board for whatever it may be?
It's all of that. It's all of that. It's all of that. And it couldn't function without having all those levels to it and all those reasons behind it. And certainly the money was massive. Again, $300 million a day we were spending on this war for 20 years. The United States spent $14 trillion on war and the Pentagon, everything from 2001 through 2021. Half that money went to contractors. Of course, the relationship between money and our Congress is well understood and well known, that corruption. But then the aspect of how policy is made, where so much of policy comes out of our think tanks, which was a deliberate thing that traces back to Newt Gingrich back in the 1990s. Like, Franklin Roosevelt, one of our better presidents, said nothing in politics ever happens by accident. There's and you can see, how did we get this think tank type complex where the Congress appropriates, as it just did, authorized $858 billion for the Defense Department yesterday. The United States House of Representatives did
yesterday.
$858 billion, and $45 billion more than President Biden requested. So they appropriate that, and that roughly half of that money goes to the contractors, goes to Lockheed, Raytheon, Boeing. Most of that goes to just 4 or 5 of them. It's really marvelous.
General
the racket
Dynamics.
it's really marvelous. The racket they've created. It really is. I mean, it's breathtaking. It's kind of awe-inspiring if you understand like what they've been able to do here. In the history of the world, has anyone been able to do something like they have been able to do in terms of controlling that amount of money, that amount of power, that amount of policy, everything about it. But, they control the film industry, the defense industry, and the Pentagon does. I mean, you can't, just to go off on a tangent, but
In
just
Hollywood.
people are clear. I mean, in order, Sony Pictures, Netflix films, whoever, Amazon Studios,
Mm.
it's well known how they receive support from the Pentagon to make their films, right? So that, they're going to make a movie and then Navy will give them ships. The Air Force will give them F-35s or whatever, and then of course they'll give them troops as well because they have troops be in the movie. This way you don't have to pay actors.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's breathtaking what they do. But the thing about that's really insidious is that that's all tied in, not just to those films that are about the military, but to any other film. So what you have is the film studios will censor projects unrelated to the military if it somehow puts the military into a negative light. So say you were to have just a story, a family drama about a veteran the veteran kills themselves. The studio will censor that, will change it, may not even make it because they're afraid the Pentagon is going to be upset about that. And in the next, Transformer films that Sony wants to make, they're not going to give Sony those F-35s because Sony also did a film where a veteran blows his head off, even though that's happening, about 18 times a day here in the United States. You know what I mean? So the control that they have. But so the American Congress appropriates all this money, $858 billion. Half of that goes to the contractors. The contractors then cycle a percentage of that, pretty small, but it doesn't have to be much, back into the think tanks. The think tanks are the ones that then go to Congress and say, this is what the threats are. This is what you need. This is why you need a third Arleigh Burke class destroyer. This is why you need $15 billion aircraft carriers, et cetera, et cetera. And it's real because when I was in Congress a lot working on anti-war stuff, Bob Casey, who's a senior member from Pennsylvania in the U.S. Senate on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, his staffer, his main person for this said, hey, 7 out of 10 briefings that we get on the wars don't come from the CIA. They don't come from the State Department. They don't come from the Department of Defense. They come from the think tanks. So the very think tanks that are funded by, not only that, the American government also funds these think tanks.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so you have the Pentagon, right? Yeah, so.
Banks. Yeah, I actually did do a video on this. Went through, so RUSI in Britain, you have the Atlantic, say the Council of Relations, and all the other ones, and every single one, same people, same arms corporations, same tech companies, same corporations, same banks, same governments, and the Atlantic Council is actually funded by NATO itself as well.
Exactly.
And you're just like, how can you read that and think, well, most people wouldn't know, but like RUSI did like a glossy piece about BAE Systems, the biggest arms corporation in the UK and in Europe. And BAE is so happy with it, they even post on their Twitter, like, thanks RUSI for, this great piece on how BAE Systems is a good employer or whatever it was.
Right.
But,
and the people that, I mean, we had example I always think about that is an organization called the New American Foundation, which wrote this they presented themselves as being like authorities on drone warfare and that they were very neutral on it and objective. And they wrote this piece basically agreeing that the American drone strikes were not killing civilians. Did all this investigation and everything else and presenting it to Congress and everything. And it turns out, of course, that they received millions of dollars from the State Department. I mean, so, but what you have then is you have the other side of this is the people that populate the top tiers of the Department of Defense, that populate the top tiers of the State Department, like Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State. Where are they coming out of? They're coming out of either the defense industries. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was on the board of directors for Raytheon. But you have a guy like Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State. What was he doing before he went back into the government during the Trump administration? He was running a organization called West Exec, which is a consulting firm, which is, they're not lobbyists. It's like this really shady thing. But what were they doing? They were doing arms deals. That's what they were doing. And they were doing not just for the American government, they were doing arms deals with UAE. And, Bahrain and other places that are, I mean, so all of that gets back to this idea of how does this war get prolonged? It's the money, but there's also, too, the politics of it. There's the hubris of it. There's the megalomania of it. There's a racism involved. I mean, certainly you would never see it in writing, but you would be among these generals and these strategists, if you will, these self-stylized strategists, these civilians, and the idea that those people could defeat us, that
Yeah.
those people could cause us to have a stain on an empire. Yeah, again, not stated outright, but it's there. But the megalomania, the hubris, the desire to see the world as a game of risk, and like we have to have more parts of the map in our color than the other people do, whoever the other people are, all those things. And then what you have, I really do think that the Obama administration with the Afghan war, that they were following the Nixon strategy getting out of Vietnam. Basically pull out, have a decent interval occur, and then when the collapse occurs, you blame it on the Vietnamese, you blame it on the Afghans. That's what the Obama administration wanted. So I think what the Obama administration wanted to do in 2009, escalate the war, show that the Democrats were better war fighters than the Republicans were, win the good war. Remember, George Bush abandoned this war to go fight his war in Iraq. Well, Obama came in, he won the good war. So we're going to escalate, we're going to surge, we're going to do this counterinsurgency nonsense. It's all going to be a big hooray, and it's going to look great. And the media is on board with us, so they'll say whatever they want. We want them to. And then what happens is, as they're drawing down American forces in 2013, 2014, well, the war in Syria gets to the point where the Islamic State takes a lot of Western Iraq. And of course, in the summer of 2014, they take Mosul. And the Republicans and conservative Democrats say this is because Obama pulled the troops out of Iraq, which is completely untrue. It's because the American government, through the CIA and the military, were supporting the Islamic State and other groups in Syria, hoping that they would only go west and not go east back into Iraq, which is where most of them came from. This idea that some invisible line in the sand between, a literal line in the sand between Syria and Iraq, the Islamic State and other groups like them were not going to cross back over, that we could manipulate, we could use them, this Frankenstein's monster, for our own purposes in deposing Assad. That's clear now. I think, if anyone has any questions about that, I'm more than happy to talk to them, because it is very clear. Statements from President Obama, statements from President Biden about this, from John Kerry, very clear that was the strategy. And that was the reason for the fall of Mosul, and not that Obama pulled the troops out, but what the White House took that political pressure was, we can't afford to pull out of Afghanistan. And you saw that in Obama's deliberations about Afghanistan in 2009. I think if you were to find and see what did his political advisors, people like David Axelrod or Rahm Emanuel, what did they say to him about escalating the war in Afghanistan? Because from everything we can see, Obama was anything but interested in escalating the wars, but he had been given no other choices. And I think his political advisors are saying, look, Mr. President, if you pull the troops out of Afghanistan and then there's a bomb goes off in Times Square, you're going to be blamed, and you're not going to win re-election in 2012. And I think the same thing occurs then in 2013, 2014, as the Islamic State is taking over large chunks of Iraq, all of the north and all of the west, basically. His political advisor is saying you cannot go forward with this drawdown, with this pull out from Afghanistan, because you're going to be blamed, because they all knew the Taliban were going to win. All the estimates were that as soon as we leave, the Taliban are going to take over. They're just hoping to get that decent interval again, right? Where we can blame it on the Afghans. So it was good as long as we were there, then the Afghans messed it up, just like what the American government did with the Vietnamese, right? It was fine through 1973. And then the North Vietnamese were polite enough to wait till 1975 to take Saigon, right? They had a decency to do that, for Kissinger and Nixon. So, I think there's all those things, right, that tie into why this war went on for so long. And without, I think, even one element of that, the war couldn't have been sustained. And of course, the media collaboration, the media complicity, which is we could do a whole show on that, has a lot to do with that as well.
I will honestly, just last couple of questions. You did that side of work, carried on. What do you think the main reason was for the failure? And can you just touch, I know you've touched on it a bit, just the actual insurgency, most of them weren't the Taliban. They're just, locals who, like any locals would probably do in America if they was invaded. They just want the occupier to go rather than it's some ideological thing. But do you think some of the failures were, Iraq derailing it? Was it a poor campaign plan? No strategy? The Afghan forces obviously weren't up to the task. If you could just touch on that, and then we can start just finishing up.
Yeah, no, I think it was always doomed. It was
Okay.
always doomed. There was never going to be Iraq derailing it. Just no. I mean, what Iraq did was basically prolong it. If you had put the 120,000 American troops and the 30,000 British troops and everything else that went into Iraq into Afghanistan instead in 2003, 2004, you just would have gotten what occurred in 2009, 2010, 2011 earlier. That's
Okay.
all you would have gotten. I mean, I think it was a willful misreading and misunderstanding of what had happened in Afghanistan for decades, how it had gotten to that point. It was the hubris. It was a lot of it was, you have what occurs. I look back at it and what occurs in the years 04, 05 in Afghanistan. And I was in the State Department at this point, and I remember Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the American ambassador to Afghanistan, coming back to the State Department, and he was very personally upset by the fact that Hamid Karzai was being called the mayor of Kabul. In reference to the fact that the Afghan government had no authority outside of Kabul. It didn't matter to anyone outside of Kabul. And he was that was a derision. And you had many in the U.S. Again, you have to go back and you have to look at like who was in George Bush's foreign policy team. Where did they come from? What was their background? And they were all neoconservatives, and a lot of them came out of University of Chicago. And they really believed in this idea of both Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilization and Francis Fukuyama's End of History. And they really believed that American liberal democracy, as we had it, even with all its corruption and profit taking and everything else, was the pinnacle of history. And that our mission was to spread that to others. And these are the people that were in George Bush's, these people like Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He really believed that. I don't think his boss, Don Rumsfeld, really believed it too much, but certainly people like Wolfowitz did. And so this idea that somehow the NATO project, the Western project in Afghanistan was failing was an affront, and it had to be addressed. And so that's why you start seeing in 05 a NATO expansion in Afghanistan. The Americans don't expand. So it starts basically in the north and goes clockwise. And kind of every country had their own part of Afghanistan. Yeah. The Americans at that point were in the east. So it went counterclockwise. So by the time it gets to the Americans, their world expands around 2007, 2008. And the Americans do start expanding their presence. But everywhere you have where you have a Pashtun population, you see a desire for support or help from the Taliban. And so this idea that the Taliban, who had fled to Pakistan, and we should all remember that the Taliban offered to surrender after 9/11, after the American entry into Afghanistan, they offered to surrender and they were rebuffed. The American government had no interest in surrender. The American government wanted victory. In the wake of 9/11, that was the political imperative for the American government, was victory. The idea of surrender negotiations, no, that just didn't fit into what the White House message was and would never be. So you have this, what you start seeing in 04, 05, 06, people say the Taliban came back in the country. My estimation, and what others, particularly say a guy like Anand Gopal will say, and if you talk to the Taliban themselves, will say is they're pulled back in. So again, go back to the story I told about Gul Sherzai, the warlord who had been part in Kandahar. Well, now he's back in Kandahar. He's setting his drug fields back up. But not only he's got his militias and everything else, he also has American commandos at his beck and call. And so he starts using them to rub out his competition, to rub out his rivals, consolidate his power. And, you also have had this war. Again, it's 2001. The war's been going on. A lot of people don't realize that by the time the Soviets invade in December of 79, 100,000 people have already been killed in the fighting in Afghanistan. This wasn't a war that started because the Soviets invaded in December of 79. It's a war that had already been going on. The Soviets intervened in it. So you've had this war that's been going on since the late 70s, and now it's 2001. So 20 some odd years of war that had turned into a civil war that, again, as we said earlier, was genocidal. And there was revenge taking that was going on that was backed by the American government. So you have revenge taking occurring throughout the country. And so and then you have an occupation on top of that, and the return of the warlords, all these things. And that's why you hear that, oh, no, the Taliban didn't come back in. They were pulled back in. And they found support among the population, and this continues all throughout this victimization, particularly the war in the south of the country and in the east of the country. Azmat Khan, in her reporting, she has found that the average family in Helmand province lost 10 people over those 20 years, 10 people in the average family killed during the war, most of them from airstrikes, right? So where do you think those folks' sentiment were? If they hated the Taliban before, well, at least, so there's all this stuff that populates this failure, and then of course you have the money that's pouring in. Who do we have? Who do we put in power? Again, the wars and drug lords. Who's the one promulgating the policy? Well, it's the American defense corporations through their client think tanks. Well, who's the one who are appropriating the money? Well, it's the American Congress that is beholden to the campaign cash, right? As well as war is good for politics. Never forget 9/11. On and on and on. And then as you get further into it, Obama pulled the troops out of Iraq. That's why the Islamic State's in charge of Mosul now. All these things stack on top of each other to where you get this stasis that occurs from 2014 on, where there's this brutal stalemate where the Taliban are winning month by month, but not by much. And it's this brutal stalemate where you have a house of cards in Afghanistan that it will be sustained as long as the Americans are spending $300 million a day. Mm-hmm. And this is how it all lasts for so long. And again, the banditry, the predatory kleptocratic nature of the Afghan government, all of that, the ability for the Taliban to stylize themselves as the National Liberation Front, all this stuff. And again, we knew that 90% of the Taliban were not ideologues. They were not reactionary religious zealots. These are people who were fighting either because of the prolongation of a civil war that their fathers and grandfathers have fought in, where they saw a threat to them from internal Afghan adversaries, or they were fighting against occupation. And we over and over again there were evidence of that. And certainly too, if you had any understanding of how the Taliban actually operated, what their order of battle looked like, as we called it, you would see that that's how it was. But there was because there was the victory narrative, there was a narrative of good versus evil, all those things. You didn't have those discussions among the American, and I assume among the British as well.
All right. Well, thanks for unpacking all that information. If you just want to let people know about your recent Senate run, and then we can actually finish this up.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I ran as an independent candidate for U.S. Senate this past year in North Carolina as a Green Party member. People familiar with the American politics know we have a two-party system that is the established system, very difficult to penetrate it. And we certainly did what we could, made some roads trying to build, a left-wing independent political movement here in the South. If you're familiar with following American politics and you see how the American Congress just voted against our railroad workers, you can see that labor has very few supporters in American government, even among the Democrats, even among a guy like Joe Biden, who claims to be the most pro-labor president in American history. So those are the types of things that we were trying to build. And it was we did about as well as independent and third or minor party campaigns do in America, which is objectively terrible. But I think we had some successes, and we'll see where all that goes. But as of now, my focus is back again on the anti-war work, as well as supporting whistleblowers and truth tellers like Julian Assange. If you're watching, you can see the Assange poster behind me. But people like Julian Assange or Daniel Hale or Ed Snowden, Chelsea Manning, reality winner, people like that.
Are you gonna? I know you're saying obviously your focus is going back onto whistleblowers and the anti-war movement. Do you think you'll try run again in the future? You're still relative.
No, I don't. Definitely not in 24, and I can't see it in the future. Really, for those who are around me, they would know I said this would be one and done. I would do what I could to help build at this point, and happy to help in the future in ways. But that's not where I see myself. Best utilizing myself and everything. So,
well, at least you gave it a go. But I mean, from the looks of it, considering how long ago you was obviously in Afghanistan, your knowledge on it is still excellent. I mean, I really enjoyed this. I mean, I read Scott Horton's book on it. and the Afghan papers one, and tried to watch as much as I could. But
Yeah.
I mean, you still gave a lot of information I wasn't familiar with. I really do like that one about Karzai's brother opening a restaurant. That is quite funny, going from a restaurant in, do you say in Boston?
Baltimore.
In
Yeah.
Baltimore to being assassinated in 2010.
Yeah. Was it 2010? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, God, everything is, Yeah. What
Yeah.
else do, hey, I could put you in touch with Scott if you'd like to have Scott come
I
on.
actually, he actually was my first guest.
Oh, great.
We did on
Yeah.
Afghanistan. It didn't really end up going to plan. It was my first interview, and I let him talk just a bit too much. But I would love to have him on again because I really do like his
Oh,
interviews.
he's great. I don't like going on with him because I kind of feel like, why am I here? There's this better than I do. Why are you bringing me on? I mean, like, there's no better authority on all this stuff. And Scott Horton, for people who want to know more about the Afghan War, certainly his book Fool's Errand. I don't know if there's a better book. Yeah, I don't know if there's a better book out there that will explain the NATO war in Afghanistan as Scott does.
Yeah, it was an excellent book. Yeah, along with his other one, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terror, both great books. But coming from yourself, who actually has experience in Afghanistan, I mean that's a whole compliment in itself, really. So, do you have any books to recommend on Afghanistan? I was going to ask you, obviously, other than these two, do you have any you can recommend people on this?
Sure. Anand Gopal's No Good Men Among the Living.
Mm-hmm.
And what I will also say is that the books I recommend about the wars, because for me, you really can't untie the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and Yemen and Somalia and throughout Africa, Pakistan, are intertwined. They can't be pulled apart for me. And so the books I recommend to understand those wars are actually not about those wars, but the two books I recommend are both about Vietnam. One I'd already mentioned, Neil Sheehan's A Bright Shining Lie, and the other is David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest. I think those two books are two of the most instructive books I've ever read on American warfare. And if you read those books about Vietnam, I think you will understand the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and throughout the Muslim world. I think you will understand those better by reading those books.
Have you?
Certainly,
sorry, go on, carry on.
I want to say certainly I would recommend. Just for one book about Afghanistan in particular, Anand Gopal's No Good Men Among the Living.
I've actually heard you say that about the Vietnam War. Just quickly, have you read Douglas Valentine's book about the Phoenix program? I haven't. I was just wondering what your thoughts are.
No, I've got it, and I've also got his. Is that you're referring to his book, CIA as Organized Crime?
That's a separate book, but he has one about the Phoenix program in Vietnam.
Okay, yeah. I know Doug, and I like his work a lot, but I've not read that book about the Phoenix program. But I imagine it's very meticulous, very well done. I mean, his work usually is. He wrote a book a number of years ago, 12 years ago or so, about the money in Afghanistan, and that was, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but that was a very good book as well. So Doug Valentine, you can follow him on Twitter and everything, and he does some really great work.
All right, I'll have a look myself, and I'll put it all in the show notes and as much as I can from what we've spoken about today. But I'd really like to thank you that you came on. I thought it was an excellent interview. You're still very sharp on the subject, and I would love to pick your brain on other, Syria or Iraq or whatever it may be. If you are willing to come back in the future, that would be fantastic. But thank you for coming on, and I hope you're all well.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for listening, and happy holidays to you all.
Thank you, Matt.